Everyone, let's try and talk about Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. It took me 2 months to read this book, not because it's bad or I didn't like it, but because it's slow and very dense, and I'm a slow reader. So let's try and start with the plot summary, which is not very easy. I would say we have two central characters, Don Gately, Hal Incondenser, and one central object. So Hal Incondenser is a teenage boy who's enrolled in a tennis academy, and Don Gately is a former reforming clean drug addict working in a halfway house. Both of those are in Boston. And the central object is something I don't want to talk about because it would give away spoilers, I think, if you can spoil this book, because it's way too much going on. Those two characters are not the only thing that we have. We have a lot of perspectives, and the narration is what makes this book interesting but also complicated. The book is told in a non-linear way. We start off with the chapter with Hal, where this chapter plays after all of the rest that comes. So this is a future outlook, and we go back and try to figure out what happened. But the second chapter is not from Hal's point of view. We have someone else. We have a lot of people's perspectives, and all of these people are either connected to Hal, Don Gately, or the object. And this is what is a fascinating thing about the book, because everything that appears in the beginning, where you have no clue where it belongs, makes sense much later, where it's connected to either one of the characters or the storyline with something that happened. And that is what is interesting about the writing of the book. I mentioned before that for the first 200 pages or so, you don't have to expect to understand a word of what's going on. Those 200 pages are actually a lot of fun to read because you appreciate the writing. You're thrown into different characters, different worlds, different perspectives. We have third-person narration, omniscient narration, and also first-person narration, and endless endnotes, which are also commenting on the things that are happening. So all of this is very interesting and makes me wonder who the narrator actually is, and I still have no good answer for this. So after those 200 pages of meeting a lot of people where you're like, where do they go? Where are they connected? What's going on? You end up with another 400 or so pages where things start to make sense, things come together. But there, the 400 pages dragged on a lot for me because there's a lot of detailed explanation and description. It's interesting and it sucks you in and you can't stop reading, but it takes a lot of time to digest. And sometimes it's, 30, 40 pages, it felt like, description of tennis training or of simple things that happen at the halfway house and just the daily routines. And somehow this makes the book great. The writing, that it's detailing everything. You know every character really closely and you get to know them better and better and better in those 400 pages. The last, let's say 300-400 pages or so are a little bit faster again because the stories start coming together. You start getting more input, you understand more, you see something happening, and that pushes you forward. So the last third of the book reads a lot faster again, and you end up at an ending where you're, let's say not satisfied. Like I said, the book starts with one chapter of Hal in the future of everything else that happens. So my experienced non-linear storytelling brain expected to get a result of how he got there. And we kind of do, but we don't get completely there. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But everything that happens in between is fascinating. You get really immersed in the life of the halfway house and the tennis academy and all the characters connected to our main two characters and the central object. Now that's sort of the plot. Let's look at the characters. There are way too many to go into detail, but what I found fascinating that despite there being a lot of not likable people, I only disliked one character in the book. That was Joelle Van Dyne. I really don't know why I didn't like her. She rubbed me wrong from the first second on she appeared. And the more we got to hear about her, and especially in her first point of view chapters, I don't like her. I just don't know. She was just a character where I was like, oh, you're not nice. None of the other characters were nice, don't get me wrong. But something in her just made me dislike her. So, apart from all of this, What is happening in the book? The book has a lot of themes and a lot of topics. Like I mentioned, we have this halfway house and a recovered or recovering drug addict. So we get a lot of addiction. It's talking about how people got addicted, how they are dealing with the AA and the NA and whatever is going on. And all of these things, you get it in detail. I would have to say, if you don't like abuse in any kind and you really can't deal with that, don't read this book. You see all kinds of abuse, detailed and descriptive, like everything else. And sometimes it's not in a yucky way. It's well written, but it's really all kinds of abuse that you can think of. On the other side, a huge part of this book deals with instant gratification, I would say. Other people call it pleasure, or the desire for pleasure and happiness. Like it's a search for happiness in this book. And there is some of that, but I honestly connected to that mostly towards the end, and because I had read it somewhere else. What I felt more is that it's dealing with showing people and how they end up somewhere and how they deal with addiction and what addiction is and what it makes out of you and what it turns you into. But a lot of it is also connected to the object, which is a form of instant gratification. And there's also the political situation, which I haven't touched upon yet. So this book was written about 20 years ago, but it's set in a time almost close to our time now, maybe a few years ago. And everything's different. I want to talk about that more in a little bit. But Canada and America are always opposing each other. So a huge part that is connected to the object and the instant gratification is dealing with the Americans' incapability of saying no to pleasure and happiness, which we also see, of course, in the drug addicts and the instant gratification of drugs making you happy easily. And all of these things are connected. And I'm pretty sure it goes much deeper than I understood and I can mention right now. So let's look a little bit at the political situation, or rather the eerie feelings I got from reading this book 20 years or so after it was written. Because back then we didn't have the world we live in now. But now we live in a world where Trump is president, and he reminded me in so many scary ways of President Gentle, the president in this nation, who is a little bit insane and obsessed with cleanliness, and he gave parts of the United States to Canada because basically those parts were contaminated and they didn't want to have it anymore. The political situation I clearly did not understand completely. It is complicated to really understand from just one reading and to not really look into it and digest it more. But it is a fascinating idea. What I also thought very fascinating is the world he describes. Apart from the president eeriness, there's this whole society, which I think resembles a lot of our society in a weird way. This book was written before the internet, before FaceTime, before Netflix and dying TV maybe. And in this book we have similar things to this, similar reactions. It is very interesting, a whole chapter on video phoning, how that turned out. And I could imagine that things would have worked like that, but they didn't. And you can compare it to what you have right now, how many people like Skyping and Google Hangouts and face-to-facing. And it's so interesting, the world that he imagined. And also with the technology that's of course different to ours, but the usage of it and the minor details that it's not that much different from the world he knew, but it's also kind of not different from our world right now. And I thought that was very fascinating. So I tried to keep this short, but as you can see, it's very difficult to talk about Infinite Jest, a 1,000-book page with so much in it that to grasp it in a short review, I can only say it is a complicated book. It takes time to read. You have to be in the mood for non-linear storytelling. In another video I already talked about what I think is helpful to finish this book and what you need to be interested in this book and to keep going. And I would add to that only the caution with, if you don't like abuse, don't read this book. There's domestic abuse, violent abuse, physical abuse, child abuse, mental abuse, all kinds of abuse. And it is a very adult fiction book. There's no, oh, we are glossing it over, or we are just not saying things, or we're avoiding topics. It's very well written, but you have to like these kind of things, because otherwise you will just not finish it. You also should be aware of that you will not get a proper conclusion, a happy ending at the end. You will have something that leaves you a little bit like, I don't have enough of these characters. I read so much about them. I know everything, but I don't know what's going to happen next. There are so many loose ends. It is a sort of an ending, but it's still loose ends because it is life, and it's just a glimpse at a few years of people's lives. And I don't know, I could go on talking forever probably. I enjoyed the read, even though it was painful and slow at times, but I don't regret reading it. Thank you for watching, and let's talk about Infinite Jest. What do you think? Did you like it? Did you read it? Did you start it? Did you finish it? Will you start it now, what you've heard about it?